Who sabotaged the Timberwolves' promising campaign after reaching the West Finals for the second straight year? With expectations at an all-time high, how did a team built for a championship run lose its grip so quickly? Was it the weight of a massive payroll, questionable roster moves, or the pressure of looming cap penalties that started to fracture the locker room? We're tracing the business decisions, the shifting chemistry, and the financial strains that turned a season of hope into a cautionary tale. The warning signs were there from the start. Let's piece together where it all began to unravel. Optimism surrounded the Timberwolves as the 2024 to 2025 season tipped off. After back-to-back Western Conference Finals appearances, the conversation shifted. No longer just a fun up-and-coming team, Minnesota was now a franchise expected to contend with the NBA's elite. Analysts pegged them as strong favorites to return to the West Finals and maybe even make a run at the championship. The city buzzed with anticipation, and everywhere you turned, people were talking about how far this group could go. Expectations weren't just high, they were the new standard. The front office didn't shy away from these expectations. Their public messaging was bold. The goal was a top seed, and the internal target was nothing short of a dominant regular season. Insiders reported on talk of a 65-win campaign, and anything less than a deep playoff run would be seen as falling short. Star players were being mentioned in MVP and Defensive Player of the Year conversations. The coach's name came up in early Coach of the Year debates. Every move, every quote, every preseason interview reinforced the idea that this roster was built to win now. In Minneapolis, the excitement was matched only by the pressure. But as the season began, reality didn't quite match the hype. Instead of steamrolling their way through the league, the Timberwolves stumbled out of the gate. Early losses weren't just disappointing, they were confusing. On nights when Minnesota should have looked dominant, they struggled to execute. The offense, which had looked so fluid the year before, now seemed out of sync. Their star forward, highlighted all summer as a potential MVP, played well but didn't look quite as sharp or decisive. The defense, once their calling card, showed cracks as Rudy Gobert's regression became a talking point. Off the court, fans and media started to question if the team's chemistry and focus were as strong as advertised. By midseason, the Timberwolves' record stood at 21-19. The narrative had shifted. No one was talking about a dynasty anymore. Instead, the questions piled up. Was the team struggling under the weight of its own expectations? Was the massive payroll and the looming threat of luxury tax penalties putting too much strain on the front office and players alike? The media began to point fingers, with some stories highlighting internal uncertainty and others speculating about the impact of financial pressures on the team's morale. The sense of unity that marked their previous playoff runs began to feel fragile. Strategically, there were subtle but noticeable changes. Rotations that had worked in the past were abandoned for new combinations that didn't always click. Plays that had brought success now disappeared from the playbook. Was this a coaching staff searching for answers, or a sign that confidence in the team's identity was slipping? Every decision was scrutinized. Every minor slump was magnified. The pressure from all sides, fans, media, ownership, seemed to make every mistake feel bigger, every win less satisfying. Despite a strong 17-4 run to close out the season and a 49-33 final record, doubts never fully disappeared. The Timberwolves had the talent, but the cracks in their foundation were now visible. The question wasn't just about on-court performance, but about whether the team could hold together under the relentless spotlight. The sense of something fragile, something unsettled, lingered even as the playoffs approached. What happened next would push those cracks even further, testing loyalties and exposing the true cost of sky-high expectations. Inside the Timberwolves locker room, the energy shifted. The team's foundation, once built on unity and shared ambition, began to fracture in subtle but unmistakable ways. The departure of Karl-Anthony Towns in a blockbuster trade was supposed to usher in a new era, but it left a leadership vacuum that no single voice could fill. The media picked up on it quickly. Questions about chemistry, leadership, and whether the new mix of personalities could gel under pressure started to swirl. Every press conference, every sideline interaction became fodder for speculation. On the court, signs of strain showed up in the details. Julius Randle, brought in to help anchor the offense, struggled in key moments during the Western Conference Finals. When his shooting went cold and turnovers piled up, the scrutiny intensified. Reporters noted visible frustration, shrugs after missed shots, sidelong glances when rotations broke down, and clipped responses in post-game interviews. The narrative turned. Was Randle's fit ever right, or did the team's new core never truly buy in? But it wasn't just about one player's slump. Whispers about team cohesion became louder as the season wore on. The Timberwolves' struggles to execute even basic plays Routine passes, set defenses, were magnified under the playoff spotlight. It looked less like a lack of talent and more like a team that couldn't get on the same page. The Thunder's relentless defense exposed these cracks, forcing rushed decisions and contested shots. Minnesota, once praised for its ball movement and collective effort, now looked tentative, with players hesitating and second-guessing their roles. One of the most persistent sources of frustration centered around Rudy Gobert. His defensive presence was supposed to be a game changer, but as the season progressed, his limitations became harder to ignore. Opponents targeted him in pick and rolls, and his offensive game stalled. The conversation shifted from his all-NBA defense to whether his massive contract was weighing down the team's flexibility. According to offseason reports, some within the organization questioned how much longer they could build around Gobert's skill set. That uncertainty seeped into the locker room, affecting rotations and morale. Players and coaches alike faced tough questions about whether the roster's construction matched the demands of the modern NBA. The pressure from outside only made things worse. As the Timberwolves season unraveled, the media narrative shifted from championship talk to questions about culture and leadership. Was the team's identity lost in the shuffle of big trades and bigger contracts? Were the new faces ever truly integrated, or did expectations outpace reality? Every misstep became a headline, every minor disagreement a sign of deeper dysfunction. This wasn't a collapse caused by one bad night or a single personality clash. It was the slow erosion of trust and cohesion under the weight of expectation, financial strain, and shifting roles. Talent alone wasn't enough to keep the Timberwolves together. The cracks in the locker room, exposed by relentless scrutiny and on-court adversity, grew wider with every setback. As the losses mounted and the sense of unity faded, attention naturally turned to the people making the decisions. The Timberwolves' problems ran deeper than the box score, and the next questions were inevitable. What were the front office and ownership doing to address the turmoil? Financial reality shaped every move the Timberwolves made as the season unfolded. The front office faced a puzzle with no easy solution. Julius Randle's $29.5 million player option, Naz Reid's $15 million option, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker's upcoming salary all threatened to push Minnesota past the second apron. That line wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It meant harsh tax penalties and strict restrictions on trades and signings. Every decision had a ripple effect. If they kept everyone, they'd be locked into a top-heavy roster with little flexibility. If they let someone walk or tried to move contracts, fans and players would question the team's commitment to winning. The front office tried to walk a tightrope. They prioritized retaining team options, hoping to keep the core together while avoiding the most punishing financial consequences. But the league's new rules limited their ability to add meaningful depth through free agency. Instead, Minnesota had to consider trades, often weighing the value of established chemistry against the need to balance the books. These weren't just theoretical debates. The choices played out in real time, with every contract negotiation and roster move under a microscope. Players noticed when negotiations dragged or when a popular role player was moved for future assets. The message, intentional or not, was clear. Business decisions sometimes took priority over on-court continuity. As the season wore on, the Timberwolves' lack of depth became more than a talking point. It was a real problem. The team avoided catastrophic injuries to its stars, but the rotation still took hits. Rookie Rob Dillingham missed 23 games, and Jalen Clark, recovering from an Achilles injury, never saw the floor. Those absences forced untested players into bigger roles, exposing just how thin the bench really was. In tight stretches, the Wolves had to rely on spot minutes from young, inexperienced talent. The result was uneven play in a sense that the margin for error had disappeared. It wasn't about one unlucky break. It was about how the roster was built to withstand adversity and whether the front office had planned for anything less than perfect health. The consequences of these decisions were impossible to ignore. The Wolves paid big salaries to a concentrated group of stars, but when depth was needed, options were limited. The front office's hands were tied by the very contracts that had once seemed like the price of contention. With few avenues to add help, even minor injuries or slumps became magnified. Instead of making bold mid-season moves, Minnesota was forced to stay patient, hoping the roster as constructed could hold up. The strain showed in the standings, in the locker room, and in the stands as expectations faded. In the end, the Timberwolves' season was shaped as much by what happened off the court as on it. The front office's efforts to balance ambition with fiscal responsibility left the team vulnerable when it mattered most. And as the season slipped away, the lesson became clear. Every choice, every negotiation, and every risk carried weight far beyond the box score. Looking back, the Timberwolves' downfall wasn't about one big mistake or a single villain. It was a mix of real issues: Gobert's decline on a huge contract, the financial squeeze from investing heavily in Randle, Reed, and Alexander Walker, and a lack of reliable depth behind their stars. The front office's push to win now, while also planning for the future, ended up limiting their flexibility, just as Anthony Edwards was breaking out as a true franchise player. If you're aiming for a career in sports management, here's the challenge. How would you balance star contracts and roster depth to avoid these pitfalls? Drop your ideas in the comments. Let's talk strategy.